Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I'm going to begin by inviting Lily and Nolan of Pi Sigma Alpha, the Political Science Honor Society, to introduce our panelists for tonight.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Lily. I'm part of PSA, or Pi Sigma Alpha, here at UW, the Political Science Honor Society, and we are introducing the fantastic speakers we have here today. And to give some reference, Pi Sigma Alpha is the only political club at UW affiliated with the department, and pretty much what we do is we offer weekly meetings where we discuss and debate current events, host guest speakers, and provide a social dimension to the major. So first, I'd like to introduce John Wilkerson, our wonderful chair of political science. Professor Wilkerson is not only the chair, but also the director of the Center for American Politics and Public Policy as well. His research focuses primarily on legislative organizations and decision-making with related interests in health politics and comparative legislative systems. Today, he will be moderating the discussion among our three speakers. Next, we have Professor Rebecca Thorpe, who is an associate professor of political science here at UW. Professor Thorpe studies state development and US political institutions, particularly the evolution of the American empire, suburbanization, gentrification, and the US prison complex. Now I will pass it on to Ryan, who will provide the following introductions.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I am the Vice President of Pi Sigma Alpha, and I will be introducing Mark Smith and Scott Lemieux. Mark Smith is a professor and associate chair in the political science department at the University of Washington. Professor Smith primarily focuses on U.S. domestic policy, which includes religion, public opinion, political communication, and public policy. He is also the author of 4 books, most recently the book titled Right from Wrong, Why Religion Fails and Reason Succeeds. Scott Lemieux is an assistant teaching professor at the University of Washington for the political science department. Professor Lemieux's focuses includes the Supreme Court, American political development, American politics, and public law.
Thank you, Lily and Ryan. I apologize, Ryan, for calling you Nolan, I think. Great. Okay. So we're going to organize this evening into 3 informal discussions. We're not going to have long presentations by the panelists. And those 3 discussions are going to be what happened in the 2022 elections, what are the implications for the next 2 years, and what have we learned about the 2024 presidential elections. And then we'll open it up to audience questions. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A option down there, and you can submit questions there. My preference would be to keep your questions short and to the point. It's a lot easier for me to ask them if it's easy for me to get right at the meat of the question. For each of these discussions, I'm also going to encourage the audience to provide their own assessments via the Q&A. So if we're talking about what happened in the elections, we're going to hear from 3 panelists, their views of what happened, but sure, why not? Feel free to provide your concise assessment of what happened as well. And I might end up sharing some of those as the conversation goes along. Okay. So my sense of what we know so far, just by way of introduction, and this is probably obvious to everyone who's here, but we need to start somewhere. So overall, remarkably less turnover than anticipated in this election. I think that's the big story of the election. Democrats are going to retain control of the US Senate. Republicans will likely control the House, albeit by a very small margin. Little change at the state legislative level, little change at the gubernatorial level. And so we have, as political scientists, models that historically do a good job of predicting midterm elections. But in this particular election, those models don't seem to have fared very well. And so I think that's a good starting point of discussion is, what normally would we have expected to happen in this election, and why didn't that happen? And so I'm going to start by inviting Becca to say a little bit about that, and then Scott, and then Mark. So take it away, Becca.
All right, thanks, John. So what happened in 5 minutes or less? Well, I'll start by reiterating something that John noted, which is that the president's party typically loses seats in the midterms. Democrats lost 63 seats in 2010, in 13, in 2014, and Republicans lost 40 in 2018, just for historical context. So we know that, given Biden's low approval rating and a poor economy, this race was largely seen as a harbinger for a Republican blowout, yet the results ultimately sustained the status quo. So Democrats kept the Senate, and even if they lose the House, they'll have only lost a small handful of seats. So regardless of the outcome, this is the best performance by an incumbent party since 2002, and it's the best Democratic incumbent performance since 1998. And I'll also note that the nightmare scenario was election rigging conspiracies, intimidation, and violence, and none of those things happened. We saw pretty high turnout. Both sides seemed to think that their vote matters. We saw some ticket splitting, and some high-profile election-denying candidates lost their races. So these are all pretty good signs for US democracy. We also saw a lot of divergent results. So, for example, Democrats performed exceptionally well in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania, but Republicans swept their races in places like Florida and New York. So how do we make sense of these divergent outcomes? Well, I think that these results show that context really matters. There was an article that came out in the New York Times a few days ago that really emphasized how the relevance of both democracy and abortion varied a lot across different states. So these issues were most directly relevant in states where referendums on abortion rights were directly on the ballot, where election deniers running for high-profile races, things like governors races, were taking place, and places where Trump tried to overturn the 2020 presidential election. And Professor Lemieux is going to talk about Dobbs more generally and how concerns about abortion rights influenced the election outcome. So I'm going to focus specifically on how threats to democracy and abortion played out in 4 specific states. So first, Pennsylvania was a really big win for Democrats. So Democrats flipped a Senate seat. The Democratic governor won by a landslide, and Democrats won every competitive House seat. Now, New York shares a border with Pennsylvania, but New York was really a pretty big night for Republicans. Republicans won all but one of the state's competitive House seats, and the governor's race was actually closer than normal in a reliably Democratic state. And if Republicans do take the House, they have New York to thank for it. So how do we explain these outcomes? Well, in Pennsylvania, the Republican candidate for governor tried to overturn the 2020 election. He campaigned against abortion rights, and Republicans controlled the state legislature. So both abortion and democracy were directly under threat in this state. Now, unlike Pennsylvania, New York is a heavily Democratic state. And the possibility of election subversion, so for example, where Republican state officials would overturn a Democratic presidential victory, is probably not top of mind. Abortion rights seem pretty secure. So here we saw the typical losses for an incumbent president's party where these threats weren't directly activated. Then we can look at a state like Michigan, where we saw a Democratic sweep. So a Democratic incumbent won the governor's race against an election denier. Democrats swept all the competitive House seats. They even captured majorities in the state House and the state Senate. In Florida, we saw the opposite. In Florida, we saw a Republican landslide. Republicans swept all of the statewide races. And of course, DeSantis won the governor's race by a 19-point margin. So it looks like these 2 states are inhabiting, pretty much different political universes. But in a way they are. In Michigan, the incumbent governor, Gretchen Whitmer, was the target of a domestic terror plot where a right-wing paramilitary group attempted to kidnap the governor and use violence to overthrow the state government. Trump directly interfered with the 2020 election results in Michigan, and there was an abortion referendum on the ballot. In Florida, there is an active Stop the Steal movement, but they never sought to overturn the election result. And while DeSantis signed a 15-week abortion ban, he wouldn't go any farther than that. So I guess I'll close by saying that there are exceptions to this trend, but in general, Republican strength at the national level didn't materialize in a lot of state races where both democracy and abortion were directly at stake.
Terrific. Thank you, Becca. Scott.
Yeah, and you know, to some degree, I'll be in on it. I think all of Becca's comments are really smart, and that's what's sort of interesting. That if you look at the rare exceptions to what political scientists call thermostatic public opinion, that is the tendency of the public to react against the incumbent party, that essentially think, generally that things the incumbent party does, sort of upset its opponents more than it mobilizes supporters, or you get situations, as say under Carter, in which, the incumbent party tries to do things and fails, which again also seems to mobilize more opposition than internal support. That didn't happen. And every other time there's generally been some particular event you could point to. So 9/11 for 2002, impeachment for 1998, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So I think one way to look at this is that Dobbs, with an assist from January 6th, were the sort of major events that sort of changed the dynamic here. That the really big, unpopular, divisive policy change actually came from the out party, not from the in party in the Dobbs case. But one thing that interests me about this is that Dobbs and abortion are not just one shots. Roe can only be overruled once, but what Roe means is that abortion is going to continue to be a contentious issue. So it's really interesting that Becca mentioned Florida, where I agree. I think that Governor DeSantis benefited a lot from the legislature holding the line at a 15-week ban, which, whether one favors it or not, still enables over 90% of abortions to go forward. But I've already, there's a report in the Miami Herald that the new Republican supermajorities want to go further than that. It's not clear that, there's going to be a lot of places in which, Republican legislators are going to want to pass bans they can now pass that are not going to be popular with the national public, and again, in states like Texas, they right now have enough margin for error that it doesn't matter. And indeed, in Florida, passing an abortion ban would probably not cost Republicans that state in the short term, but it would certainly be bad for Governor DeSantis's presidential aspirations. And I do think that this means that it's not an issue that's necessarily going away. And we don't really know what kind of effect it will have. And as Becca said, and as our colleague Jake Grumbach pointed out earlier this year, it really is going to vary a lot at the state level. But, we can see in Washington, where the two competitive races involve, kind of a combination of rural areas and parts of suburban Washington and Portland, the news was not good for Republicans, who probably previously benefited from Roe basically taking the abortion issue off the table. And so the biggest upset right now in the House is Washington 3, which is a district that Trump carried by 4 points, and the previous Republican incumbent carried by 13 points, but was primaried for voting to impeach Trump. And so, so I think that shows you Becca's themes uniting, that I think part of it is that I think election denialism did not go over well, but also I think, abortion being salient, and Senator Murray kind of plastering the airwaves with ads about what might happen if Republicans take over the Senate. I think that's a big deal, and it's not an issue that will go away. And there's a larger issue here too, which is that this new Supreme Court supermajority is almost something new in American history. Generally, when there's been a Supreme Court that's kind of entrenched, it's generally an ally of kind of an identifiable governing majority. So whether it's the Warren Court in the 60s or the Fuller Court, the more conservative Fuller Court during the more conservative Gilded Age and earlier part of the 20th century. Now we sort of have a very close party competition with the Supreme Court along strongly with one side, and that definitely does not have modest ambitions. And this is really interesting because in 2016, public opinion towards the Supreme Court was that conservatives liked the court a lot less and cared about it a lot more, which was pretty major factor, I think, in Trump winning. And that's no longer the case. Not only has the court got a lot less popular, it's become dramatically less popular among liberals, and it's also likely to continue to issue opinions that are high profile, and the reaction to them splits along partisan lines. So that's something that we haven't really seen in American history. It's kind of something new under the sun, to have a Supreme Court that's identified with one party that isn't a governing coalition, but has enough strength to really prevent the kind of retaliation against the courts that happened under Jefferson or was threatened under FDR or happened under Lincoln. We really don't know what that's going to look like. But I think that may mean that some of the models and some of the patterns we've seen in political science, may not apply as much going forward. And that is what's always one thing that's important to emphasize, that as political scientists dealing with elections, we're dealing with a very small number of cases, particularly given how much history changes. So past performance is never, fully predictive of future results. So I think, I suspect that this election may seem pretty anomalous, but I also think that we may not see all the same kind of thermostatic swings, that we have in the past, just because there's going to be a lot of cases in which congressional gridlock is sort of paired off against the court doing a lot. And I think it's very hard to know how that will play out and how that might affect coalitions going forward. So I'll leave it there and make sure we have enough time for questions at the end.
Terrific. Thank you, Scott. Mark?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to piggyback on what Becca and Scott said, and also link back to John's original kind of setup, which is, hey, we have some political science, models that would have predicted strong losses for the incumbent party. It didn't show up this time. What's up with that? My opening take would be to say, this is pretty much the same take I offer on any empirical subject, which is the world is complicated. Pick any political phenomenon, it's going to have many causes. And we try to parcel out what are the different causes and ascribe weights to them and to try to get some kind of handle on it. But invariably, there's going to be some things we leave out, and whatever theories or models, whatever you want to call it, that we construct to explain the world ultimately are of simplifications. Now, in the case at hand, we certainly know the president's party normally loses seats, but that's really just an empirical regularity. Like there's no sort of fundamental theory or model attached to that. People have constructed ones, but the way I like to think about it is that's just the constellation of forces that are at play in midterm elections, and some of the things sort of cancel each other out. And we often end up with that regularity, but even as a regularity, it's not an ironclad law, as Becca pointed out. 2002, the incumbent party does pretty well, did pretty well in 1998 as well. So there's no not written in stone that the president's party is going to lose seats. And in the case at hand, a few things were cutting the other direction. One of the most important being candidate equality. So the Senate minority leader, Mitch McConnell famously said during the summer, he made a reference to quote candidate equality, and it seemed like he was sort of setting up the possibility that, hey, we're not going to do as well as some people are thinking, and he was almost sort of shifting the blames, and the blame here would be pretty squarely on Donald Trump, who recruited candidates who would support him personally and would often be election denying candidates with respect to the 2020 election. And some of those candidates wouldn't necessarily be appealing to a general election audience. They might be appealing to a primary election audience of purely Republicans, and they did win the nominations. I'm thinking here specifically of Mehmet Oz, in Arizona, Blake Masters, Georgia, Herschel Walker, maybe you could point to a couple others as well. And so far, they're not doing so well in the general election. And so in previous cases, have we had a past president who had as much control over his party as an ex-president as Trump did? Well, no. And so given that candidate equality always matters, it's just normally candidate equality kind of bubbles up from the bottom, where like state and local party organizations help to recruit candidates, and often they pay a lot of attention to, is such and such a person electable, and they will try to fund that person and clear the path for them to win the nomination. In this case, you had Donald Trump, who had his own interests at play, separate from the parties, and some of the people that he got nominated wouldn't have been the strongest candidates, and that's basically what Mitch McConnell was saying, and that proved to be prescient comment. So you got the candidate equality angle, which then overlaps with the election denial angle. As Becca pointed out, all of the strong election deniers running for governor or for state secretary of state, they've all lost. And with Kerry Lake now losing in Arizona, that's a wrap on those candidates. Now that's an interesting phenomenon, because if you looked at polling and you asked people, what are the most important issues before you in this election? Pretty consistently, the economy or inflation, something in that realm. Crime often popped up. Abortion did pop up, but typically like something like third. And then protecting democracy was generally lower. And there was a prominent article in the New York Times a lot of people read, about 3 weeks ago, that showed polling indicating like, oh, people don't seem to care about democracy. And the thinking was, Republicans are going to sweep, and nobody cares about protecting the integrity of elections and like peaceful transition of power and acknowledging when you lose and all those things. Well, that kind of assumes that you can just sort of rank order issues, and people are, I don't know, somehow like the issues directly translate into candidate positions, which then directly translates into outcomes. But what that doesn't take into account is, what if you have a candidate who is strongly identified with one of the lower tier issues? They may not do as well as you might think, even though that issue wasn't ranked as highly, but because they have a prominent position on it that's unpopular, that might be enough to really work to their disadvantage. And that seems to be what happened here. So yes, based upon the polls, protecting democracy was, not in the top like 2 or 3, might have been like, 4 or 5 in terms of priorities. Nevertheless, it matters if you have candidates that are very clearly identified with an unpopular position. So those candidates did spectacularly poorly. And then the other thing at play, which Becca and especially Scott have already pointed out, like we have this thermostatic model where the president's party will pass policies, and generally there's sort of a negativity bias, and so you're more likely to be mobilized against what the president's party is doing than the other side is mobilized to support what the president's party is doing. But we have the abortion issue this time where it's coming from the Supreme Court rather than the president, but still in the issue environment. So that comes into play as well. So I would say, if you just put together various forces that are shaping elections, it was a different mix this time than we had in previous midterm elections. And so we end up with a different result. And this should be pretty standard for political scientists or any social scientists. The world's complicated. We try to identify the forces that are shaping outcomes. It's easier to identify those forces after the fact, of course, than beforehand. Explaining afterward is easier than prediction, but leaving that aside, I think political scientists are well equipped to try to explain what happened here. And I'd like to think we've, between the 3 of us, made some progress on that score.
Well, I have a bunch of questions. So this is great. One of my questions was going to be about candidate quality and its impact. So that's terrific. I think the first question I'm sort of wondering about is polling, right? It seems like, once again, the polling didn't really get this right. Does anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I know I was just talking, but I'm going to disagree with the premise. I think the polling was actually very accurate, particularly Nate Silver, 538. If you look at where his projections were, they ended up very close to the result. Now, a lot of people look at Real Clear Politics, and Real Clear Politics, it's has more of a conservative bias, whereas Nate Silver, it's more of just trying to do good social science. And Real Clear Politics like excluded some polls because they thought they, quote, weren't accurate. But so Real Clear Politics, their averages weren't so predictive. But 538 was very accurate. Obviously some of the races are a little further off than others. But on election eve, I think they had it as almost a 50-50 shot as far as who was going to control the Senate. And, Republicans are going to, Democrats are going to control it, but not massively, 51 to 49, pretty close. So I would say that overall, this was a good year for polling, as opposed to both 2016 and 2020, when the polls were off, more favorable to Democrats than it turned out. This time, if you sort of, shake them out and look at what happened across a range of races, they were actually very accurate.
Yeah, I agree with Mark, and that's what, that there was a sort of, and there's an article that appeared in the New York Times about 3 weeks before the election, and this caused a big debate between Nate Silver and Nate Cohn on Twitter. But it was kind of odd in that they found 4 House polls that showed the Democratic candidate running ahead of Biden, but then sort of wrote up the story as the Dems are in huge trouble. And I think part of that stems from the mistakes in 2016 and 2020, is that not only were there mistakes, in both cases there were mistakes in one direction, essentially undercounting white people without college degrees who were like moving overwhelmingly to the Republican Party. So I think that, and in all fairness, I think that there was a real question in sort of trying to analyze the polls about, should we assume that the polls are missing these people again, or, did the pollsters finally find a way to correct that? So I'm not necessarily criticizing anybody who went, certainly before the election, I was not putting a great deal of faith, in polls that suggested that it was going to be a much better result than usual for the midterms. And I think it's also compounded in 2020 in that Florida is one of the first states to count their votes, and the polls were really bad in Florida in 2020, which makes it look like, Trump's support was being understated by 5 or 6 points rather than 2 or 3. So, the polls of 2016 and 2020 weren't terribly bad by historical standards. It's just that they were wrong in the same way in a very competitive election. But this seems to be the best performance the polls have had in a while, that really they pretty much got this. And again, whether that's just kind of luck, whether that's a midterm election having a higher turnout than usual, which, that's a big problem with polls, is trying to figure out who's going to show up. So the kind of increased turnout that has happened over the last 10 years, maybe that's correcting for some of those issues. I don't know. But I actually think that this year, unlike the previous 2, I agree with Mark that my understanding is that, especially if you look at sort of reliable, nonpartisan polls, they did, quite well in a way that they weren't necessarily expected to.
I generally agree with all of that. I mean, I think if anything, to the extent that polls were off, they might have slightly overcorrected after 2016. I guess the other thing to note is that there were a lot of unusually close races in this contest. And so I think that a lot of the races actually were within the margin of error. If you look at polling sources like Nate Silver, as Mark mentioned.
Thanks. So, one of the obvious questions here is, how did Republicans get this election so wrong? It seems like, for example, Mark was talking about putting up extremist candidates, right? And I think a lot of election strategists understand, right, the implications that if you don't field candidates that are relatively close to the center, you risk losing, right, the voters in the center, right? But it doesn't seem like that happened this time around in a lot of cases. So, I mean, how do we diagnose what's happening in the Republican Party?
I would quickly add that, to me, the case of Carrie Lake is actually one of the most interesting, in that on paper she would seem like a candidate who would be very appealing. Former newscaster, generally high name recognition, kind of a large fan base, not necessarily strongly associated with partisan politics. But there was a perception that to win the Republican primary, she needed to sort of question the legitimacy of the 2020 election. And that, I think, is the really big thing, is that that it seems like, we've talked about how laws of political science don't always apply. And one of the biggest cases of that is the party decides thesis. The famous and very good book pointing out that generally, despite the rise of presidential primaries, generally the candidate favored by party elites generally wins. Trump has confounded that to some degree. And now Trump is the party elite. So that there's this tension between the kind of candidates that Trump likes, the kind of candidate that Mitch McConnell might like. And I also think we shouldn't deny agency to Republican primary voters, either. That ultimately, it's not like Trump's endorsements always win. That ultimately, people like Doug Mastriano are saying things they want to hear. I mean, he's the Republican governor from Pennsylvania produced one of the most remarkable data points I've seen from this election, which is that if you take out Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, Josh Shapiro, the Democratic candidate, still would have won. So, Oz was just kind of an ordinary underperforming candidate. Mastriano was a disaster, but he won his primary election by more than 20 points. And his other main opponents were also people who denied the 2020 election. So I think that's part of it, is just that in a primary system, party elites only have so much control over the process. And ultimately, it's kind of the party's core voters and not kind of marginal voters who pick candidates. And I think that's where you can end up with, candidates who don't necessarily, appeal to the mainstream voter. And again, in a lot of cases, it doesn't matter. But in the case of closely contested statewide races, it can matter a lot.
I'll just add on to that. I think that because of Trump's influence in shaping a lot of the candidates that ran in a lot of the more high-profile races, and because of the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, it just wasn't a normal referendum on the incumbent president. A lot of voters really viewed this election as a choice between Biden and Trump. And that seems to have largely sabotaged the Republican Party. So you have, poor candidate selection where you have unqualified candidates taking very extreme anti-democratic positions, like Walker in Georgia, Mastriano and Oz in Pennsylvania, Dixon in Michigan, Masters and Lake in Arizona. I think we also saw what political scientists call negative polarization, where the Democratic base might not love Biden or Pelosi or Schumer, but they're genuinely frightened of the Republican Party, particularly a lot of these election denying candidates that are taking extreme positions that alienate the majority of voters. So the normal turnout decline that you see for the incumbent party didn't happen in this context. Whereas on the flip side, right, if you think about Republicans, well, Republicans might think that Biden is, either incompetent or corrupt, but I don't know that he really, activates that same level of that sense of threat that that Trump does, and that a lot of his handpicked candidates did.
So I'm going to shift the subject a little bit here. Political participation. So part of, I think, the logic of Trump and election denial and that sort of thing is to mobilize the base, right, of the Republican Party, get them out to the polls and win in that way. Did that not happen, right? Or did what do we know about political participation in this election? And for example, across different age groups, given that we know that older voters tend to trend Republican and younger voters tend to trend Democratic. Mark, do you want to take that?
Sure. So there's been a prominent debate, especially on the left side of the political spectrum, on do you win elections by appealing, to the middle? Do you win the middle to your side, or do you win elections by mobilizing your base? And that's been a pretty divisive matter among progressive sort of strategists and intellectuals. Arguably both of them, of course, matter. But I think this election would point a little more toward the appeal to the middle strategy, in that if you look at the actual composition of the electorate, which you can do by looking at like party registration in states that have registration, not Washington, of course. Or through like exit polls and asking people what party they normally identify with. The actual electorate that showed up to vote was slightly Republican, based upon stated party affiliation. Well, okay, true, but then there's also a good share of the public that's independents. Some independents, they sort of say that, but they really lean toward one party or the other. But even so, there's some share of of Americans that really are independent and they're kind of up for grabs. It maybe is a smaller share than it used to be, but it's still there. And so effectively what Democrats did, even in an electorate that had more Republicans in it than Democrats did a very good job of winning the independents. And I think you could make the case, well, the independents kind of are the middle, if you will. And when Republicans are throwing up, Carrie Lake and Doug Mastriano and some of the other candidates that have been mentioned here, they're going to look extreme. And I think it was the Wisconsin governor, Tony Evers, is that his name? Where he said, boring wins. So if you have a boring candidate versus an extremist, the boring candidate looks like calm and reasonable. Let's go with that person. So I think that does speak toward persuasion effects as opposed to mobilization effects, which is not to say that mobilization doesn't matter, but if one side is putting up unpopular candidates, the other side doesn't necessarily have to mobilize its base as strongly if they can just kind of hold their base and then appeal to the independents that still exist. That's a winning coalition.
Great, thanks. Terrific. So let's shift gears and instead of sort of looking back at the election, think about the next 2 years at the national and the state levels. Is there a message from voters here? In particular, I guess the question is, what's going to happen in Congress, given that we've got, divided chambers now. The Democrats are going to control the Senate, the Republicans are going to likely control the House, and obviously we have a Democratic president. What do you foresee in terms of issues at the national level, and if anyone's willing to take issues at the state level, that'd be interesting as well. I need to call on someone. How about Scott?
One thing I'd like to say is that I actually think, and this, of course, I may be biased towards my field of study, but I think that the Georgia runoff election is perhaps a little more significant than some people think, just because one difference between having 51 senators and 50 senators with the vice president to break ties is that in a 50-50 Senate, the committees are divided equally. So that allows Republicans to throw up a lot of procedural roadblocks, which you can get around, but that slows down the paces of judicial appointments, of executive branch appointments, and so on. And it also means that every single Democratic senator has a veto. So, if there's some particular candidate that Senator Manchin or Senator Sinema don't like, then it's back to the drawing board. So I do think that it matters, especially assuming that Republicans take over the House. You're not going to see a lot of significant legislation passing. Maybe somebody else wants to tackle the possibility of a catastrophic global meltdown. Although I think the sort of very narrow Republican majorities in the House, I think, make the debt ceiling hostage play less likely. And another thing too is that for going forward, having they sometimes call it when a Senate majority leader can allow a member to vote no on a tough vote in their district, a golden ticket. So one of the things that saved Susan Collins in Maine is that McConnell had enough margin for error to allow her to vote no on Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, which may well have allowed her to win re-election. So having a vote to spare may mean, giving the chance for a Sherrod Brown or a Joe Manchin or a Kristen Sinema who's facing a tough re-election campaign to vote no, to kind of show I'm independent from Schumer and Biden, I'm my own person, without actually derailing appointments. So I think you're going to see a real acceleration, in the confirmation of federal judges, and that's especially going to be true if there's a 51st Democrat elected to the Senate. And then there's, of course, the outside possibility. This is, given what the Senate maps look like in 2024 or 26, this is the last opportunity for Republicans not to have a Supreme Court supermajority. Obviously, it is enormously unlikely, particularly since no Republican nominated justice is going to resign voluntarily. But this does, Democrats holding the Senate mean that if we do get an unexpected event such as Justice Scalia's death in 2016, President Biden would be able to fill that seat. So that's not a likely possibility, but I don't think we should write it off. there also is also an outside chance that Justice Sotomayor, based on what happened with Justice Ginsburg, may choose to resign and be replaced by a younger judge. Again, I wouldn't bet on that, but I don't think that's a non-trivial possibility. And none of that would really be possible. If Republicans had won the Senate, basically federal appellate judicial nominations would be over for the next 2 years. So that's one, even though legislatively it doesn't matter a lot, because the Senate has control over judicial and executive branch appointments, the difference between 50 and 49 is a huge thing. So that's probably where you're going to see the biggest difference.
Yeah, so to add on to that, so assuming that Republicans take the House, which seems likely, I think we'll see legislative paralysis on most issues. So spending for things like healthcare, social services, and education were blocked in the current Congress. I think they're just going to remain, they'll be blocked in the next one. Biden will have a veto, so he'll be able to veto major cuts to Social Security and to national abortion restrictions. There might be some room for bipartisan legislation, around the margins, but assuming that McCarthy is elected to majority leader, he will only be able to support legislation that gets some Republican support, even if not, a majority in their caucus. And he'll need to retain the support of his caucus, which includes a lot of extreme far right Republicans in the MAGA wing of the party. And that's going to be a really, really difficult needle to thread. I think Republicans have signaled that they want more investigations. So investigations into Hunter Biden, investigations into Anthony Fauci, about concerning the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the number of refugees and immigrants that are coming into the country. I think it's possible we'll see impeachment proceedings. So Taylor Greene introduced a resolution to impeach Biden in the previous Congress, which was largely symbolic with a Democratic House majority, but it won't be with a Republican House majority. And I do think we'll see a debt ceiling fight. And I think House Republicans will use the debt ceiling to extract policy concessions from Biden.
But wasn't part of the message of this election, right, that extremist positions like that, right, the voters didn't support them?
So in a major statewide race, but not in safe Republican House seats. And there's a New York Times feature that showed that something like more than 375 Republican candidates running for House, Senate, and state races cast out on the 2020 election. And more than 50% of them won their races. And some of them were incumbents, but some of them were newcomers. So the 2/3 of Republicans in the House have cast doubt or on the 2020 election. There's more than a dozen in the Senate and more than 24 in the states. So that threat has not disappeared at all.
Yeah, great point. What about immigration? Is that an issue area where Republicans and Democrats might make some progress? Mark.
In a word, no. This has been such a tough issue for the last 20 years. George W. Bush famously wanted to get the immigration reform, and his base pounded him down on that. Barack Obama thought, I'm going to take a strategy of strong border enforcement to show I'm serious about this issue, and that in turn will open up the space for compromise on a bipartisan immigration reform that would bring together both parties and the business community and civil rights organizations and so on. And that didn't work either. In 2014, you had the Gang of Eight, I think it was called, and so there was a group of senators, and you did get immigration reform passing the Senate that year, but not the House. If anything, the politics of immigration in the last several years have become more complicated. I think the Republican base for a lot of the proposals that would be anything that would be bipartisan, if you're a Republican and you're supporting that, you're going to get crucified by your base. And on the Democratic side, there's been more movement in the other direction. I think it'd be hard really right now for a lot of Democrats to agree to some sort of package that would like strengthen border enforcement and then pair that with more legal immigration or some sort of easier path to immigration for people that are already in the country. So I think immigration, it's just Trump seized on that issue, and it became more polarized in his wake than before. So it was a long shot before he was on the scene. After he's on the scene, I don't see it happening.
And if I could add one more thing, I think what a lot of people forget is that when Mitt Romney was kind of in a very tough primary fight in 2012, the issue in which he most conspicuously decided to appeal to movement conservatives on was immigration. He famously attacked Rick Perry from the right for supporting a very modest DREAM Act to allow high school students who were brought by their parents into the country illegally to attend school, and he attacked Perry for that. He famously sought Trump's endorsement and got it. So it's a little counterintuitive, given that Romney is now Trump's biggest critic in the elected part of the party. But what that indicates is that Trump on this issue was as much a symptom as he was a cause. That there was clearly a lot of anti-immigration sentiment within the Republican Party, so that while a lot of Republican Party elites, especially the pro-business wing of the party, has been sympathetic to immigration reform, the base of the party has not been. And I think that's part of why the immigration reform bill failed in the House. While I think Trump is a big problem and exacerbated that, it also transcends Trump, and I think makes a compromise really difficult. It's just impossible to see a compromise that would be acceptable to enough House Republicans and to enough Democrats. So I agree, and I think that it even goes back further than Trump, although it's 2002. 2012 story seems like 100 years ago now, but you could see it bubbling up even then.
And I think, even if it's extremely unlikely scenario that Democrats and Republicans can agree on policy grounds. Republicans are looking forward to 2024. And so they're looking at those incentives as well. They don't want to give Democrats a win moving in to that election. So, I think that, there are like competitive strategic incentives for them not to cooperate on a lot of these, more high profile issues.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about Republicans. Let's talk about Democrats in terms of the next 2 years moving forward. What do Democrats need to do to be successful at the national level? At the state level, Democrats lag behind Republicans in terms of control of state legislatures, as well as governorships and that sort of thing. What does the Democratic Party need to do to be more competitive moving forward? Whether that be issue emphasis or strategy. Scott.
Well, if you're going to put me on the spot, I think one thing is that the Democrats are in kind of an interesting political position in that they're probably the majority faction right now in the United States. Democrats have won the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 national elections, but they have a coalition that is really not optimized for either the Senate or the Electoral College. So one reason that there seem to be more Republican extremists in Congress than Democratic ones isn't anything, I think, inherent to the nature of liberalism and conservatism. It's simply that Republicans have a lot more margin for error. If Democrats are going to get Senate majority, they have to win seats in states that Trump carried. Republicans don't need to win in Biden's states to have a majority of the Senate. So that just inherently, that the Democrats owe their slim Senate majority to Joe Manchin winning in a state that Trump carried by almost 40 points. So that just has a natural moderating effect. I don't think it says anything about the nature of things. So it just puts Democrats in kind of a difficult position. It's not that they're failing to articulate popular policies so much as that they have a base that is becoming more educated, more multicultural, and that's just not the sort of increasingly white without college degree based Republican Party just is better represented in the Electoral College. I would say, and I don't have any answers, and I'm hoping that the smarter people on the panel will help here. I think one source of concern for the Democrats is the extent to which Hispanic voters in a lot of crucial states are trending Republican, which is not, I think, something a lot of people expect in 2016, and that helps to explain both why Florida has become a solid red state and why Texas is remaining more solidly Republican, even as it becomes more diverse. And a lot of people kind of, assume that, as these states became more racially diverse, that they would naturally trend towards the Democratic Party, and that hasn't happened. And there seems to be, African American and Hispanic, people without college degrees are trending slightly in a Republican direction, but in a way that's really important given the swing states. I don't know if I have a good means of addressing that, but I think that would be a big source of concern for me, because if that trend continues, it's going to be very hard for the Democrats to compete in national elections, even in elections where they can win the popular vote. So I think that would be a source. Again, it's not my field of expertise to know how to do that, but I think that would be, despite the good news that Democrats got largely in the last midterms, I think that would still be a big source of concern. And the results in Florida and Texas would suggest that it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, and I'll say some things that are consistent with Scott, and also hopefully add something new. So your initial question, John, was what can Democrats do to have some appealing issues or position themselves well in the next 2 years? I guess I would say, who are these Democrats of which you speak? That sort of implies that Democrats are this like unified bloc, and like someone is controlling it, is like, we're going to come up with the right candidates and the right issues, and like this is going to take us to victory. That's just not how our party coalitions are constructed. The Democratic Party, it's a bunch of individual candidates and individual voters who are all got their own agenda, and then they sort of come together as a coalition. But the nature of a coalition is different people have different ideas and different interests, and somehow they have to try to manage that. But I'm reminded of AOC saying that she's not a big fan of Joe Biden, and in a multi-party system, they wouldn't be in the same party, but they do happen to be in the same party in our system, and so she's going to try to work with him, even though she has very different public policy ideas than he does. And similar to what Scott said with respect to Joe Manchin in West Virginia, for the first year of the Biden administration, Manchin was sometimes working with Sinema, the main opposition to, the Build Back Better plan, which was initially this huge cluster. It had, childcare, it had, universal pre-K, it had a couple other things I'm forgetting, and the climate change provisions. And it looked like it was going to fail entirely. And Manchin was standing in the way, and everybody on the left was like, "Oh, Joe Manchin, he's just an awful guy, and he's despicable." The kind of amusing part about that on the left was the alternative to Joe Manchin isn't AOC winning in West Virginia. The alternative to Joe Manchin is the furthest left candidate that can win in West Virginia. So if it wasn't Joe Manchin in West Virginia, it's going to be a Republican. So what I'd like to say to my progressive friends is, Joe Manchin is the best you're going to get. If you don't like what Joe Manchin has to offer, you need to win in North Carolina or some of the more purplish states. And if you can't win there, and Joe Manchin is your 50th vote, Joe Manchin is as good as you're going to get. Now, he did eventually, of course, come around on the climate change provisions, and so we did get the Build Back Better in 2022, which included the climate change plus some prescription drug regulation for Medicare, which a lot of progressives have wanted for a long time, and some higher corporate taxes. And so the things that ended up in that bill were things that progressives wanted. It's just they wanted that plus a bunch of other stuff, and they didn't get the other stuff. But the reason they didn't get the other stuff is not because of quote Joe Manchin, because that's just the nature of a coalition. Is it's individual candidates and individual voters, and then they have to come together and find out what they agree upon. And at the end of the day, what they could agree upon was the thing that passed. So as far as going forward, what's going to emerge? Well, once again, it's just all these different people with their own ideas and interests. And if there was somebody pulling the strings who could come up with like a really popular agenda that would get progressives excited and would be very popular with the public. Well, okay, maybe that'd be a great strategy, but there's no mechanism to accomplish that given the nature of our system.
I guess just to add on to that, there are also structural impediments that make it really difficult for Democrats to pass policies with majoritarian support, such that they even need like super majorities or really, really large majorities in order to actually effectively govern. Scott referenced some of these problems in his comments as well, right? So that because of the way the parties have sorted along ideological and geographic lines, the Senate currently empowers rural voters in states with a smaller population at the expense of urban voters in states with larger populations. So this means that senators representing a minority of the population hold an effective veto power on national legislation that a majority of Americans support. So, for example, even with a 50-50 Senate this past term, there were hundreds of bills that passed in the House that died in the Senate. Not bills that the Senate necessarily voted down, but bills that didn't even come up for debate and didn't even get a vote. So two major pieces of voting rights legislation. So HR 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. There was a bill that would have prohibited wage discrimination. There were a couple of bills implementing background checks on gun sales. There was an LGBT rights bill, a bill strengthening unions. So these were all policies that were supported by senators representing a majority of Americans, but not a majority or the necessary super majority of the Senate.
Great, thank you. So there's a question in the chat that kind of moves back to, it's more general, and I think it's a good thing for us to talk about though. So the question is essentially asking, how do I understand this polarization between the Democratic and Republican electorates, right? That seems to be so pervasive in American politics. Where does that come from? Becca, would you like to give that a go?
Sure. Trying to figure out how to give like either the short answer versus the long answer. Well, I mean, I guess the short answer is that, well, my attempt at the short answer is that in recent decades, the parties have largely sorted along ideological and geographic lines. So Bill Bishop refers to this trend as the big sort, where liberals have largely concentrated in metropolitan areas in more populous states, while conservatives tend to reside in non-metropolitan areas, so smaller cities, suburbs, and rural enclaves. There's a political scientist, Alan Abramowitz, who refers to the Great Alignment, where race, religion, and ideology increasingly align and they correspond with people's partisanship. So increasingly we have white, religious, conservative, non-metropolitan, Republican base that's pitted against a more multiracial, secular, highly educated Democratic base. A political scientist, Liliana Mason, argues that this sort of social sorting increases our level of tribalism and animosity against outgroups, even among people with much more moderate issue positions. So, for example, we see that increasingly people don't want their children marrying someone, right, in the opposing party, and people in both parties increasingly view the political opposition as, alien or dangerous or even an existential threat to the nation. So, some of it is driven by what's called increasing ideological polarization, where parties have taken more extreme positions, but some of it is just rooted in social sorting and the physical isolation between the parties and the distance between the parties.
One additional thing to add is that it's interesting how much of this was actually a matter of choice and will. I just happened to be reading Sam Rosenfeld's book, The Polarizers, as I try to put together my syllabus for my American democracy class. And the argument of that book is that, a lot of this ideological sorting of the parties was actually the result of choices by party elites. And interestingly, political science plays a role in this. There's a very widespread critique of the party system in America by American political scientists in the 50s, that the parties were such loose ideological coalitions as to not offer voters a meaningful choice at all. If you're a voter in 1952, you would much rather know what jurisdiction a member of Congress represented than what their party affiliation was, because there were tons of liberal Republicans and lots of conservative Democrats. And indeed, that Democratic coalition basically had the most liberal and the most conservative factions in American politics in it. And then, of course, that you had the same movement on the right. Famously, Phyllis Schlafly's book for Barry Goldwater was called A Choice, Not an Echo. This idea that that the party should be offering a clearer view. And there's a lot of merit to that critique, to be clear, that it is true that for democracy to be meaningful, voters have to have some idea about what a party stands for. But the first thing that happened is that the nature of the primary system, caused that to sort of accelerate more than I think a lot of people necessarily, especially from the political science side, would have anticipated. And I think a lot of political scientists assume that this polarization would still involve parties trying to appeal to the median voters in different ways. And that isn't always what has happened. And then there's the second difficulty, which is that we could easily see the downsides to the sort of loose and incoherent party coalitions of the 50s, but there are a lot of parts of our constitutional system which sort of implicitly need cooperation to run, because the framers, didn't anticipate or in denial about political parties. So things like the Senate having to vote on judicial and executive branch nominees is not something that's super well suited for very partisan parties. So I think it's going to be essentially impossible now for a president to get a Supreme Court and maybe even any appellate court judge confirmed under an opposition Senate. Not a problem for the next 2 years, but down the road, that's going to be an issue. So I think there's will here, and there's also just unintended consequences. And again, I'm not saying, I don't think we can go back to the party system of the 50s, and I'm not sure that would be desirable. But I do think it's an interesting tale of sort of how things that make sense at a time sometimes kind of take on a bit of a life of their own, and we don't necessarily see some of the bad things that can come from changes as well as the good parts. But I recommend anybody's interested in that should check out Sam's book, because it's really good, and I think it's a very interesting story.
I do remember reading recently that 20 years ago, only about 40% of the electorate sort of recognized, important differences between the parties, and now it's up to 90% or something like that of the electorate sees, clear differences between the two parties. So things have really changed. One of the questions that came up here, just one more question related to this is, what impact, do changes in the electoral composition of the parties have on how parties view themselves moving forward? And so the specific example was, the increasing support for the Republican Party among Hispanics, right? Is that going to, presumably that might have an impact on how the party views itself and how it, what its priorities are moving forward. Does anyone have any thoughts about that? Mark, for example?
I'll take a stab at it. I'm not sure I'm going to have any unique insights here. Well, with respect to Latinos, Hispanics moving toward the Republican Party, much like I mentioned earlier with respect to Democrats, there's sort of often an assumption that Hispanics, Latinos are quote people of color, and they're like this unified bloc, and they're somehow allied with African Americans and Asian Americans as quote the people of color, and they're supposed to all think alike. Well, that's just not reality. Hispanics, Latinos, it's a composition group, including Mexican Americans is the largest bloc, but in Florida, Cuban Americans are the most prominent. Puerto Ricans, Venezuelans, some other national groups, and so there's differences across the national groups, and even within them, you can't assume unity. So to the extent that we are seeing the Hispanics, Latinos moving toward the Republican Party, it's really working class. I think that the class division here is really strong. So, you know, in the Seattle Times, some of our listeners, I'm sure, read Danny Westmead, and he had an interesting article a few weeks ago on education polarization. So the parties are, linking back to Becca's point about the sorting, are sorting more in education than they used to. So higher education is moving in the Democratic direction, lower education is moving in Republican direction. And that's true across racial groups. So we've even seen, you know, some African Americans moving, you know, I mean, from a low base, but, you know, if you go from winning, you know, 7% of African Americans to winning, you know, 11, 12%, like, well, that on the margin, those are votes that are really valuable to Republicans. Now, on the flip side, of course, Democrats have been picking up more of the highly educated, you know, quote, you know, white suburban women, and those are valuable votes too. And in if you compare like the Trump 2016 coalition to the Trump 2020 coalition, his 2020 coalition had more minority voters in it. And you might think like, hey, he gained minority voters, he should have done better in 2020 than he did in 2016. Well, he also lost some white voters, particularly the more educated white voters. And in the states that really mattered, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, in the net, that was a loss for Trump. So you have that sort of trend going on. Meanwhile, younger people across races are more Democratic than the rest of the population. So like every 2 years, we get a new crop of, you know, 18-year-olds who are more Democratic than the rest of the population. So we're sort of feeding the Democratic side, but then that could be partially offset if middle-aged people are, you know, moving Republican. So I guess I would link back to my point at the outset, which is any political phenomenon, in the case here, like the composition of parties, it's a lot of causal forces coming into play at the same time. And some of them can be partially offsetting. I think that's the main story of what's going on here.
It's interesting also that if current trends continue, it looks like educational polarization might actually start to blunt the racial polarization that divided the parties. So I saw that exit polls suggested that 1/3 of non-white, non-college educated voters supported Republicans in the 2022 midterms. And Republicans actually made gains among both Asian Americans and Latino voters. And most of these gains occurred in red states, so they didn't necessarily affect the outcome, but it did bolster their numbers. So yeah, it's hard to say whether or not this is, you know, an aberration and contextually specific, or, you know, part of a broader trend. I think that remains to be seen.
Yeah, the last thing I would want to add is that so much of this also depends what parties do in office. So the blueprint that Rick Scott, who's in charge of the Republican senatorial campaign, put out during the elections involved, you know, sunsetting all major legislation after 5 years, including Social Security and Medicare, you know, sort of really unpopular cuts to social programs. You know, that didn't happen during the Trump administration. The attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act failed. You know, so, you know, but, you know, if you say get, you know, Trump or DeSantis wins with 56 Republican senators, and you get, you know, major cuts to Social Security and a national ban on abortion after 12 weeks, you know, that can change. You know, I think we have a tendency to assume that trends will continue. You know, if you had said that in 2012, Ohio would be a completely locked Republican state after Obama won it twice, I would not have believed you. So these things change, and they can also change based on how you know, parties choose to exercise power. So, you know, Republicans may look at it as, you know, we're getting some support among, you know, working class voters of all races. You know, we may want to sort of, you know, economically moderate, you know, fines of things. Or they may say, you know, if they have a big win in 2024, let's say, let's do what we've always wanted to, you know, let's sort of enact, you know, Paul Ryan's fiscal policies. And if you do that, you know, because keep in mind that George W. Bush did extremely well with Hispanic voters in 2004. And then that support kind of frittered away after he made privatizing Social Security his major issue in 2005. So that's the other thing too, is that the actions of both parties, you know, the coalitions, you know, sort of have some natural evolution, but they can also change based on what people actually do in power. So I think that's always an important thing to have in the back of our minds too, is that political events can also, you know, scramble things, and we can never fully anticipate the future for that reason.
I'll say the three of you are quite impressive in sort of handling these on-the-fly questions. I don't think I could do it nearly as well. Let's shift gears. Let's talk about 2024 and what this past election portends for 2024. And obviously, no one has a crystal ball here, so feel free to just say whatever you want with us recognizing that. But I'll just start off with you know, a couple of things that come to mind for me. Biden and Trump, well, let's just say Biden, really? 2024? Trump, really? 2024? How about some, you know, who are our alternatives for 2024 in terms of the Democratic Party? What does the Democratic Party need to be doing in terms to win in 2024? And what about the Republicans? And sorry, I'm rambling here, but the other, so David Brooks in the New York Times had a article titled "Has the Fever Broken?" Immediately after the election, essentially suggesting that, you know, the American public has had enough of Trump and, you know, and election lie claims and all those sorts of things. And so now we're ready to move on. Are we really ready to move on in 2024?
I'll take the last part of that question. I completely disagree. I think that Trump is still unquestionably the front runner. She'd still, you know, radicalized the Republican Party. There are hundreds of election deniers on the ballots, and not only in, you know, the state races that, you know, we talked about where those candidates pretty much uniformly lost, but also in safe Republican House and Senate seats. And there are really very few Republicans, if any, in Congress that are willing to openly defy Trump. I mean, most of them were either purged like Cheney or didn't run like Adam Kinzinger. So I mean, I still see him as, you know, as the future of the Republican Party. Whether or not he would get the nomination, I think remains to be seen. But I think that, you know, that he still has a really large base in the Republican Party that he can, you know, that he can mobilize. And I think there's going to be a fight within the Republican Party. You know, there's clearly after, you know, these elections, a lot of pushback to, you know, giving him the mantle. And I think, yeah, it just remains to be seen how that all plays out.
So given this election, that's good news for Democrats, I assume, right? If it turns out that Trump is the front runner in 2024, it would seem to suggest that that's sort of the best position Democrats might be in.
I would caution. I mean, I think that some caution is warranted before we necessarily embrace that position. I mean, I think that these elections showed that a lot of like Trump's proxies and his handpicked candidates are not successful at the state level, but Trump himself was not on the ballot. And Trump will be, you know, trying to win the electoral college and not one specific state. So yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, he still, I guess I'm reluctant to conclude that because of the midterm outcome, that means that the best possible scenario for Democrats is for Trump to be on the ballot in 2024.
I kind of share the same boring answer. The first question that Becca does. Anybody who reads my Twitter feed, which I absolutely do not recommend, I disagreed with a piece today in New York Magazine that argued that DeSantis should be considered the front runner, and you should read it. I claim no ability to prophesize primary elections, but the way I look at it is that it was just going to be very difficult to beat Trump if he wants the nomination, just given the strong support he has among his party's base. And as Becca says, the incentives the Republican leaders have, to not cross him. They had the opportunity to take Trump out of presidential politics when he was impeached in 2021, and Mitch McConnell was apparently open to it, and they notably declined to take that opportunity. So I'm not sure what's going to change now. And I would also, echo Becca that, if we had a national popular vote for president, I think Trump would be a disaster for Republicans. But the reality seems to be that Trump has a smaller coalition than Mitt Romney, but a much better one to win the Electoral College. I mean, the last election, Biden won the popular vote by 5 points, and Trump was in about 45,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Arizona from winning the Electoral College. The last election was actually very competitive if you look at the Electoral College. And it's going to be very difficult for a Democrat to beat Trump by 5 points again. Now, we also don't know how the Electoral College map may play out. If a state like North Carolina might, that there's a lot of unknowns there, but I would not necessarily be sanguine about that. And I would also, again, assume that Biden, if he's able to run, will run. I can't imagine a major challenge to an incumbent president, especially. And I think the Democratic performance in the midterms, I think, pretty much removes that possibility. If Democrats had a disastrous showing, maybe, but I don't see that in this context. So I think until such a time as Biden decides not to run, I don't even know how to speculate. I think that if he doesn't, then it's going to be very interesting, and I think that has the possibility of being a very divisive primary. But as of now, I think Biden is saying that he'll run again, and I have no reason to think that he won't. So I myself will choose to cross that bridge when I come to it, but Mark may be more bold there, so I'll leave it to him.
On the Democratic side, I might come back to that, but I did want to at least offer just in the spirit of fun debate here, a path by which the Republican Party does once and for all purge Trump. So it was pretty obvious he was not the choice of the party elites in 2016. He had virtually no support among elected Republicans. Scott mentioned earlier this, the thesis of the party decide, party elites pick the nominee. The way he became the nominee is by winning the base and against the party elites, who were kind of split amongst a variety of other candidates, none of whom could consolidate all of the anti-Trump sentiment. And so he wins a bunch of primaries, like 35%, 40%, but through the winner-take-all system, he accumulates all the delegates, gets the nomination. Once he gets the nomination and becomes president, he's also the commanding figure in the party, and was able to squelch any opposition. He also did that during the primaries. I mean, famously reduced Ted Cruz to a puddle. He said, Ted Cruz, your dad tried to kill JFK and your wife is ugly. And Ted Cruz responded by making fundraising calls for Trump. I mean, it was just an absolute obliteration. And then you look at what he did. Anybody who rose up to potentially challenge him during his administration, you had like Jeff Flake in Arizona, who was like trying to take that side. It was so obvious that Trump had control of the base. Flake retires. Bob Corker in Tennessee was kind of trying to do the same thing. It was obvious Corker was going to get destroyed in the primary. He retires. So while Trump was the nominee and the president, anybody who sort of rose up, he could pick them off one by one. And it was also obvious that during both impeachments, a bunch of Republican elected officials in Congress really wanted to impeach him, but they were scared. They were protecting their own hides. Like Scott mentioned, Mitch McConnell was open to it, but once it became clear that there was going to be no sort of rally around him, he too backed off, and he ended up voting against impeachment. And then look what happened to the small number of members who did vote for impeachment. Like there was 10 in the House and something like, 7 or 8 in the Senate. Of those 10 in the House, several retired, a couple got defeated. There's only like 2 left. So clearly, electorally, it was a bad strategy for Republicans to vote for impeachment, especially on the House side. But so now I'm getting to the point. What's the path where the party does purge Trump, which I promised? It really requires all of the Republican elites jumping together. Previously, they were kind of jumping one by one, and going one by one gets you the Ted Cruz treatment. But if they all go together, it could work. And if you just look in the last few days among conservative, I don't know what you would call them, intellectual leaders might be going too far, but how about social media figures, people like Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro, whatever's the right label for them. They've made really strong anti-Trump statements in the last several days. The New York Post runs that headline, Trumpty Dumpty, about how Trump ruined the Republican Party's chances. So if you're losing Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro, and you're losing, Rupert Murdoch's, media empire, is Fox News next? If all of these Republican elites sort of go together and they say, we're no longer with Trump, we're going to try to consolidate around Ron DeSantis, it sort of provides protection for all of them. It's harder for Trump to take on all of those people at the same time than it was for him to take them one by one, like he was able to do previously. And he also is not the president anymore. So yeah, he's still got a lot of support among the base, but he doesn't have the kind of institutional power that he did before. And so the path by which the party pushes him aside once and for all is basically all those elites jumping together. And I think that strategy could work. I'm not necessarily predicting it, but if it's going to come to pass, that would be the mechanism by which it comes to pass.
So related to that is the question of where the money comes from, right? Because obviously, if a bunch of elites jump and the money doesn't follow them, right, then they're not in a good position at all in terms of moving forward, right? So what about funding of the Republican Party, for example, and to what extent does expectations about contributions from, for example, major donors, right, as well as the base, play into these sorts of calculations?
My thinking is that fundraising will not be the problem. Jeb Bush raised tons of money. Marco Rubio raised tons of money. Chris Christie raised tons of money. I think that, particularly given the results of the midterms, I think that, getting donors to back, to make candidates financially viable, I don't think that's the main barrier. The barrier is simply going to be elites are going to have to be persuaded that the alternative candidate to Trump, whether it's DeSantis or not, can win. I think that's going to be the biggest thing. Sort of money is sort of a baseline, but again, how much did Jeb Bush pay for every vote in Iowa? It's just like some astronomical, that it only, it only goes you so far. So that's really going to be it, is that there's just going to have to be, that the candidate is going to have to convince them that they're a viable alternative. The opportunity is there, and then it's unlikely to be a big field. And the case is that DeSantis really has this attempt to unite people and is this really great politician. My one note of caution is that I think what this election reveals about him is a little overstated. He basically ran about, 1.5 points ahead of Rubio. This was not a situation in which the governor was just far ahead of his own party. Unlike in, say, in Ohio, where like Mike DeWine is ahead of the party, like there were situations like that. This was not really one of them. Basically, DeSantis had about the performance you'd expect of a generic Republican or a little more. Now, doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't have what it takes to beat Trump, but I guess I'm in the I'll believe it when I see it camp. I agree that will play out as Mark says if it happens. Right now, I'm skeptical that it'll happen, but I will say that I don't think money's the problem. I think that an alternative to Trump will be able to raise money. It's just a question of can they get enough support in the polls to convince elites that it's in their interest to back him, given the possibility, because, if you come for the king in this case, you best not miss. That's, I think you're just going to have to convince people that you're viable. And that's really, I think, going to, I don't know if Becca agrees with that, but that's at least how I would do it.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with that. I think that donors will generally follow popular support and whomever they see as a winnable candidate. including Trump. I think like Trump is seen as potentially a liability right now because his handpicked candidates didn't do well in the midterms. But if Trump demonstrates that, that he, is going to animate his base and he's going to, draw a large turnout, and he is potentially, viable path forward for the Republican Party, then I think they'll rally around him again.
What I always remember is that, there literally a tape surfaced of him, confessing to sexual assault on tape, and Republican elites spent about 48 hours saying, well, I couldn't look my children in the eye if I voted for him. And then apparently it was, I can't look my children in the eye unless Trump goes up by 3 points in the polls, in which case, whoop, right back on board. So I guess and again, history doesn't always repeat itself, but there were just so many cases in which Republican elites were like, oh, we're done with Trump. That's it. It's over. But if he's the Republican candidate and people think he's going to be the Republican candidate, the support is always going to be there. So the task to a challenger is going to be to make people think that he can lose, and that's, I think, fundamentally what it's going to come down to.
He's a phenomenon, that's for sure. Constant surprises, source of surprises. Well, this is great. I really appreciate Becca, Scott, and Mark taking the time to talk about these issues and playing with questions that I managed to come up with. Great questions from the audience, by the way. Also thank PSA for the introduction, for sponsoring this event. And we'll have another one in winter quarter, subject to be determined. So thank you for attending and have a nice evening.
Thank you so much for attending, everybody.
Thank you.